Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Inverness. On tonight's panel, Angus Robertson, former SNP campaign coordinator for the 2014 referendum on independence, currently Constitution, External Affairs and Culture Secretary for the Scottish Government. Craig Hoy, chairman of the Scottish Conservative Party and a member of the Scottish Parliament since 2021. Pam Duncan-Glancy, also elected to Holyrood last year, now Scottish Labour's spokesperson on social justice and social security. Journalist, commentator, Daily Telegraph columnist and editor of the right-of-centre political magazine The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and award-winning comedian and contributor to TV shows such as Frankie Boyle's New World Order and Have I Got News for You, Susie McCabe. Welcome to my panel, welcome to the audience here in Inverness, good to see you, and of course welcome to you at home. Do join in the conversation the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time, and we'll see what you've got to say about tonight's topics. And to that end, let's hear our first question, which is from Ian Columbine.
Will there be another independence referendum in 2023?
Well, Angus, no surprise, I'm going to come to you first.
So yes, I hope there will be a referendum in October next year, and the reason why I think there should be is because we had an election where this was the main issue last year in Scotland, and we had a record majority return to the Scottish Parliament, elected on a manifesto that there should be a referendum.
Can I just ask you just one something, Angus, and sorry, and then I will absolutely let you carry on. Nicola Sturgeon was asked, in reference to the 2021 election, how someone who wanted her to be First Minister but did not want a referendum during the COVID recovery, how she should vote. And Nicola Sturgeon said they should vote for me on Thursday, safe in the knowledge that getting through this COVID is my priority. So how does that make it a mandate for independence?
Indeed, because the manifesto said we need to get through COVID and then we will have a referendum within the first half of the Scottish parliamentary term. I think given developments this week, I think it's important to focus on the heart of the matter, which is not about whether we are yes voters or no voters or we're undecided voters. It's about whether we live in a country where we are able to exercise our democratic right and decide on issues, regardless of where we are on the question. We had an election last year. The issue was decided. The majority of MSPs elected to the Scottish Parliament were elected to give us all the choice about the country's future, and it behoves politicians in London and their supporters here in Scotland who disagree with independence to acknowledge that in a democracy it's the people who should decide, and it's not for our democracy to be blocked by Boris Johnson or anybody else. We voted to have a say, we should have a say, you all should have a say about the country's future.
So the first thing I'd say is that Angus must have been knocking different doors last year than I was, because there's absolutely no assurance that people were talking only about a referendum. And the fact that the SNP are trying to make us into a single-issue country is really, really disappointing. And I think, Ian, the question of whether or not we should have an independence referendum next year, I don't think so. And Angus said a moment ago to focus on the heart of the matter, and then he went on to talk about the referendum. I want the government focused on waiting lists. 1 in 8 people are sitting on waiting lists in the NHS. Child poverty is rising. It's at 26% across Scotland. In some parts of Glasgow, where the First Minister is the representative, it's up at 36%. So we've got rising child poverty, waiting lists going through the roof, and I think the government actually really needs to be focusing on that. They had a lot of mandates when they were elected, and all of those mandates deserve the attention that this government seems to be giving the attention to the independence referendum.
Fraser.
Well, to answer the question, I don't think there'll be a referendum for 3 reasons. First of all, there's the legality of it. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's asked for Supreme Court, but the weight of legal opinion seems to be against her. Secondly, you've got whether the SNP would win that or not. I mean, most of the last opinion polls suggest not. They're quite close. But you get quite a lot of nationalists, actually, who don't want this referendum. They think it'd be crazy to have it unless at least we're ahead in the opinion polls. If you lose twice, as they found out in Quebec, then that's pretty bad for an independence movement. But the biggest reason I think there won't be one is because Scots simply don't want one. We've had opinion polls, we had another 2 this morning, showing the majority of people don't want there to be a referendum in the timetable that Nicola Sturgeon's talking about. I mean, partly because you've got the SNP voters who aren't sure it's a good idea, but also you've got a country that's exhausted. The democratic voice of Scotland was given not so long ago in a referendum in 2014, and that was the vote to stay in the Union. And there is also the democratic rights of people who don't want to be put through this mill again and again and again, especially when public opinion hasn't really changed much from 2014. The polls show Scotland is pretty much still where it was all those years ago. So why take a vote on a country which doesn't want it? Now, Angus has got his activists here to keep happy, so which is what I think is happening here. They want to think that there's a great battle just around the corner. But really, I think Boris Johnson might be tempted to call it bluff, because if there was one and they'd fight it, the apparent opinion polls would be a real struggle, especially when you start to ask who pays the pensions, in what currency, how would you cope with a hard border with England, but there'd have to be after Brexit. Difficult questions, and I don't think the SNP in its heart of hearts really wants to answer them. So I'm not that worried about a 2023 referendum.
I'm going to go around the audience. I'll give you a chance to answer some of those points, Angus. I'll just go around the audience. The man there in the black top, yes. Oh, yes, there.
Thank you. We don't run a country based on opinion polls. And the SNP ran in an election along with the Greens and all the other unionist parties, well, not the unionist party, I should say, based on an electoral system set up by the British government under the Scotland Act. Under that Act, the proportional system returned a majority for an independence referendum. That is a fact. And it is our right under the first article of the United Nations to choose how we determine the future of this country. Whether that's every second minute or every 1,000 years is irrelevant. It's not about being put through the mill, and people who are maybe finding that they're being put through the mill by being asked questions that are relatively simple, maybe should disengage from the process overall, because this is normal around the world.
Okay. The woman there in the blue scarf. Yes, you in the blue scarf there.
Yeah, I'm afraid, much as some politicians might like it to be the case, democracy in Scotland did not stop in 2014. So much has changed since then. In 2014, I was a yes voter and my English husband voted no. 2023, I'm a yes voter again, and guess what my husband's going to be voting? And you can trace that directly back to, amongst other things, the Brexit vote, everything that's happened, the way the UK government seems to be lurching inexorably towards the right, and very little of that is what the Scottish people voted for or are happy about. So I think bring it on.
Okay. And here in front.
Thanks, Fiona. You asked the question, should there be a referendum in 2023?
Well, the question is, will there be?
Will there be? In my opinion, there probably will be. I hope there's not. I'll tell you why there shouldn't be one, though. One, no means no. We've already debated that already. But secondly, I think we all agree that we want the best thing for Scotland in this room, okay? Do we really want a society which is split down the middle? Because currently, we're talking about roughly 50-50. Now, the SNP gentleman will say it's 52, it's 48, it's 48, 52, depending on what it's going to be. We're talking about fine margins here. Now, I have to admit, if the vote for independence was 74 independents and 30 against, I would go with the majority. I don't think that's a good thing for Scotland, because it's going to divide Scotland right down the middle, and it's never going to get better until we have that conclusive debate there.
Okay. And the man there the man in the blue top with the glasses, yes.
Hi. Whether we have a referendum or not, surely now isn't the time. Financially, as a country, we are in real trouble. You're going to spend countless millions on a referendum that may happen, it may not. Surely it should be ploughed into where it's needed now, not in some pipe dream that's possibly in 16 months.
Okay. Craig.
I hope there isn't another independence referendum next year. And I think the people that email me and that I speak to in the street, in the pub, hope there isn't going to be another independence referendum next year, because that's not their #1 priority right now. Throughout this audience, right throughout the country, people are struggling with the cost of living crisis. They're struggling with public services that haven't come back after the COVID pandemic. Only this week, we found out that Scotland's cancer waiting times are the worst on record. The child and adolescent mental health service waiting lists are through the roof. People are waiting more than 2 years for routine operations. The pupil attainment gap in Scotland is now at its worst for 5 years. So there are huge issues for us to contend with. The cost of living crisis, helping families through that, making sure that we get our public services back up and running again. Those are the people's priorities. And I say to Angus, why doesn't he, for once just take independence off the table, focus on the people's priority and govern in the Scottish national interest and not in the interests of the Scottish National Party?
And Craig, as far as the Conservatives are concerned, would there ever be a right time for there to be a referendum?
I'm a Scottish Conservative and Unionist. It should come as no surprise that I don't want an independence referendum now, next year or into the future.
So what is the democratic way that there ever could be one?
So you wouldn't expect me to spell out to the SNP how they might hold an independence referendum. But don't forget, at this point in time, 60% of Scots don't want. 6 in 10 Scots, including many SNP supporters, are saying this is not the time, Angus. So why doesn't they focus on the day job and move on with that? But you can't expect me to spell out how, where, why and when there should be a referendum.
No, I'm just asking in principle, would that mandate ever be accepted?
Well, in principle, there may be a point in time where we get to that, but you wouldn't expect me to flesh that out, much in the same way you wouldn't expect Angus to flesh out the case for strengthening the union.
Susie?
I don't know if there'll be a referendum. Right, I tell jokes for a living. I am not a lawyer. My personal opinion is I hope there's a referendum, and just a few points that have been brought up there. So we're talking about the vote to stay in the union. In 2014, I was told, oh, if you vote no, you'll still be in you'll still be in the EU. If you vote yes, you'll be out the EU. That's a massive issue for Scotland. We're a small country. We're a small country with a falling population. We need that migration. In this area alone for tourism, you need that. If we go across a little bit to places like Ullapool, they need that EU membership for our fresh produce that Murdo so kindly listed the other day on GB News, all the fresh produce that we export to the EU. With regards to the currency, Mervyn King on STV tonight, Mervyn King, a man who ran the Bank of England for 10 years, actually said it was entirely feasible for Scotland to keep the pound and have a shared currency. Mervyn King. That his job was to run the Bank of England. And he's like, yeah, no, it's entirely feasible. We're talking about society split down the middle. If we're not going to do things because they're divisive, that's an absolutely ridiculous argument. We live in a country shaped by social class, right? Social class is divisive. Our education systems is divisive. Yes, there's inequality. Yes, there's poverty. I believe, personally, my vote towards independence, it's not going to be an easy road. It's going to be a difficult road. But I'm willing to take a chance on it. Now, I don't have kids, but my mates have kids, and I've got kids in my family. And that vote maybe just isn't for me. That vote is for further down the line.
It's not that long since we had a referendum vote. We've just come through a 2-year pandemic. There's an awful lot of things wrong in our society. The cancer waiting lists, 25% of people not getting treated for first-time treatment for cancer within that 62-day period. Okay. That's awful. We should be spending the money on the people who really, really need it.
Every waking hour.
Yep. I'm not saying there should never be a vote or a referendum on independence, but I don't think the time's now.
And when do you think the time might be, out of interest?
I think you're quite right. I think it's our children's choice. I think it's probably in a generation or two's time.
Could I just come in?
There, because I understand what you're saying with regards to the NHS. I actually heard a former colonel of the armed forces on the radio today who said that this country now has to make a choice between defence spending and healthcare spending. So, as an independent nation, are we going to choose to spend that money on defence, or are we going to spend it on the NHS? Because ultimately, when that power rests at Westminster, 100% that money will be spent on bombs and bullets.
Okay. Pam, you want
so
to come in?
I actually... I mean, the way that money is being spent by both the Tory and the SNP government just now is an absolute disgrace. The waste of money, the disregard for the cost of living, the fact that people cannot put food on the table. 400,000 people in Scotland have missed energy payments because they can't afford to pay for them. So all of these things are huge, huge issues. And you make the point, Susie, about inequality and it's about our children's future. It absolutely is, and social class is a really key issue. But do you not think that people in England and across the rest of the UK also face these social class issues? My ambition for a better Scotland is not narrow for a better Scotland, but my ambition is for a better United Kingdom, for a better Europe, for a better world. And we should never narrow our ambitions for anything like that.
Let me hear a bit more from the audience. The man there with the glasses in the middle.
Hi there. I feel that we should have it now, because all we're going to do for the next, say, 5, 6, 7 years is say, when's the referendum? When's the referendum? I think there was changes with the European referendum and obviously being promised to stay in Europe. I feel we need to do it now, and if we lose, accept it, and then try and prevent a Tory government in Westminster and focus on socialist left-wing values in Scotland.
OK. The man there with the beard.
Yeah, I've heard at least 3 different versions of people saying that the people don't want a referendum. And I would suggest politely that the people that are saying that should look at the most recent election, where 49% of the electorate wanted a referendum. Look at the last general election, where the Labour Party had their worst result since 1910, and 1 MP represents Scotland. So they're either not listening to the people, because people aren't voting for you. Tories aren't listening to the people, because people aren't voting for you either. Right? You haven't been in power in Scotland since 1955. Right? Maybe if you all listened to the people, then you would understand what we're saying. You guys are custodians of our country. You work for us.
Yeah, could I?
OK, hang on. Let me just come back to Angus. Angus, what you're certainly hearing support for a second referendum. You're also hearing people say from the panel, but also from the audience, never mind a referendum, you need to be concentrating on getting things and improving things right now that we're worried about, like the cost of living, like NHS waiting lists, like all sorts of things are impacting life today.
Sure. So what normally happens is when political parties win an election and they form a government, the opposition then calls on the government to do what it was elected to do. And the government in Scotland and a majority of MSPs elected to Holyrood were elected so that there should be a referendum and the public should be able to choose.
But they were also elected for other reasons as well. No, hang on, Angus, wait a minute. They were also, hang on, let me interject. They were also elected for other reasons as well.
Indeed, but for losing political parties to lecture the election-winning parties and suggest that the people should not have their say has got more to do with the fact that they oppose independence rather than the fact that they're prepared to uphold democratic standards. What I'm trying to say this evening is forgive me, let me finish my point. I think at the heart of this question is whether we as Democrats are going to trust the people to make their choice. And I trust the people. We're not governed by opinion polls. We are not going to be driven by the views of the parties that lost an election. We are going to deliver for the people. The people voted to have a choice. The people should have a choice. And all of the arguments around the difficulties that exist post-COVID and with the austerity situation that we have handed down from Westminster, that's not an argument to not have a choice. That's an argument to have a choice. Let's bring it on. Let's have a referendum and let's settle the issue.
You talk about the sovereignty of the Scottish people, but why does the sovereignty of the Scottish people in 2014 mean absolutely nothing to you?
No, it means, of course, in 2014, people took a view on independence at that stage. But democracy is not a single moment in time.
It's not a single
People have the right. People have the right to choose and change their mind. People have the right to reflect on the fact that they were lied to in the Brexit referendum. We were told, vote no to independence, and we will stay in the European Union. The public was lied to. We've been taken out of Europe against our will. 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain. There's been a material change in circumstances. People have voted to have a say in a Scottish referendum, and that's exactly what they should get. Either we live in a democracy or we don't.
We hear Fraser. Hang on, let me bring Fraser.
I'm just remembering another thing a politician said in 2014 campaign. Nicola Sturgeon was saying that this referendum would be a once-in-a-generation event. Now, that makes sense, because otherwise, where do you stop? Now, a few days ago, the Scottish Parliament was due to debate drugs deaths in Scotland. Scotland's got a drug death rate 3 times higher, not just than any other part of the UK, but any other country in Europe. That's a really important thing. That debate was delayed so they could talk about independence instead. Now, that is the issue. It sucks the oxygen. A devolved government is supposed to be looking at the priorities, and you guys will end up in this never-ending. That's the problem. There's never going to be a time. You'll never take no for an answer. It was, if there had been a massive shift in public opinion, then fair enough. But there's been no evidence of anybody really significantly changing their mind in Scotland. And why devote all of this precious political attention on things that SNP's constitutional fantasies rather than the real huge problems which you were elected to solve?
Susie, let me just want to hear a little bit more from the audience and I'll come back to you. Yes, the person right at the back with their hand up. Yes, you.
In 2014, one of the big, shouts from the No campaign was that, vote no if you want to remain in the European Union. And then 2 years later, we were dragged out against our will with a 62% Remain vote. Surely that's a massive change of the goalposts, and it's a reason for another referendum.
Right. Something like a third of SNP voters voted no, voted for Brexit. That's the thing, on both sides of it. I mean, 40%, no, it was little less. 2 in 5 Scots pretty much voted for Brexit. So it goes on both sides. You get the double outers who don't see why you should take back control from Brussels only to go back in, and Westminster only to go back to Brussels. So that's why the overall equation hasn't changed very much, because it's not true to say every SNP voter wants Brexit. A third of them did want Brexit, 2/3 didn't.
OK. It's a young person there in the glasses, yeah.
I'm only 17 years old. I couldn't vote in the first Scottish referendum. I couldn't vote in the Brexit referendum. I was only able to vote for the first time last year. Now, so much has changed since then. 2 out of the 3 exams I've sat, I didn't sit because they were cancelled. So much of society has changed since 2014. And the generation of young people that have lived through the pandemic, that have gone through all these things that no other generation has, should be able to make the decision about our future and our country.
Can I make a point?
Pam, I'll come to you and then Susie, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. And the woman who's just spoken is absolutely on the button. The way that education is being dismally failed in Scotland is a disaster, and the exams that you sat in the last couple of years would have been very, very different had the SNP government properly handled education over the pandemic. And but Angus, I need to also pick up. So you said that it was this lies, and what about the First Minister who told us in the election just past and in the election last May that actually she would be laser focused on the COVID recovery? We have absolutely not come out of the pandemic yet, because it's the thing I find absolutely staggering is that any time I ask the question of the Scottish Government in the Chamber about the NHS waiting lists, and believe me, they are in some mess, on behalf of my constituents, the Cabinet Secretary turns around and says, oh, but we're still in a pandemic, it's still going to take a wee bit time to get us out of that. Either we are or we're not. You can't have it both ways. So we need a government that is absolutely focused on education, focused on health, so that people in Scotland can absolutely move forward from this pandemic. We are not out of the woods yet. And in fact, the clinical director this morning, you quoted someone from the NHS earlier, Susan, the clinical director this morning said that he is concerned about rising cases and numbers. So we have a serious situation that still requires the attention of the government. And while the government is distracted by an independence referendum, I seriously worry about the future of our NHS and our education system.
But also, I think Fiona, part of the reason they want to talk about independence is because they don't want to talk about their abysmal record on schools, hospitals, roads and railways. This is a diversionary tactic.
Can I...
Ferries as well.
There's a few things here. So first of all, Fraser brought up drug deaths. Scotland needs to have a grown-up conversation with itself about drug deaths in this country, right? Every death caused by drugs is tragedy. Now, there's a twin issue here. There's 2 types. We've got our heroin and our opioid deaths, which are deprivation, urban areas, densely populated areas. We know all the reasons. And we have treated them the same way we have always treated them, and it doesn't work. So Scotland needs to go and look at things like safe consumption rooms in those areas, right? In more rural areas, we need to look at needle dispensaries. That's also going to be supervised, stopping the spread of HIV, hepatitis, safe, clean areas to do that. On the other side of that coin is cocaine deaths. The numbers are rising in the over 40s males now.
But Susie, in terms of getting this back to the need for a referendum or not.
This is what we didn't discuss in Scottish Parliament, because there's no point.
This is where I'm going with it, right? And at some point, Scotland needs to have another conversation with itself about decriminalisation, and Scotland cannot do that because that's got to come from Westminster, and no one in Westminster is going to look at
but all the points you've just made about prevention overdose centres, those are the sorts of things that we could introduce now here in Scotland. And Paul Sweeney, a colleague of mine in Parliament, has already been putting proposals on a bill for that. So we could do that now.
Scotland has to have these conversations, and we need to look forward to decriminalisation.
Absolutely.
Are you going to tell me the Conservative Party believe in decriminalisation of drugs?
No, but what I am going to say is that we're bringing forward...
Do you, Greg?
No, we don't. But what I am saying is that we are going to bring forward, and Douglas Ross is going to bring forward, a right to recovery bill so that everybody gets access to rehab who needs it in Scotland today, because presently they're not, and that is a tragedy.
Well, and another thing on that
subject... Susie, really briefly, because otherwise the audience... And look at all those hands, they're not going to get a word in.
Another thing on that subject is you need to take out the criminality, you need to treat it like mental health, take it off the NHS, put it into the public sector and get it fixed.
OK, the man there in the glass with his hand up in the blue shirt.
Hi, we're just coming out of a pandemic. We've got a cost of living crisis. Education's going down the toilet. The NHS has got waiting lists as long as your arm, and perhaps a little bit longer. But who cares? Let's have a referendum. What nonsense.
So why... Angus, do you think that's a legitimate question? I heard you say Tory activist.
Well, I'm delighted. We know one another well from my time being the Member of Parliament for Murray, where the questioner was a leading Conservative Party activist. So we take a different view on all of this. The point that I'm trying to make, and repeatedly so this evening, is that we will be on different sides of the argument about whether Scotland should be independent or not. But regardless of our political affiliation, regardless of whether we're yes or no voters, do we trust the people to decide? And for Fraser and others just to blithely talk as if the issue has not been debated at length, and the people have voted on this in an election in Scotland, Craig, where you lost in East Lothian against the SNP. And I would have hoped that you would have learnt the lesson. Standing against a referendum was not the popular choice in East Lothian. People in East Lothian and in most constituencies in Scotland returned SNP members. Is that the Parliament has been elected with a record majority, the biggest ever... I don't know why you're shaking your head, Fraser. It is the biggest ever majority in the Scottish Parliament in favour of a referendum, and that should take place in the first half of this Parliament. Of course, we can debate about all of these other issues that are really important, but the idea that you park democracy, that you break democracy, that you take people's choice away from them, that is not acceptable in a country where democracy should be at the heart of our national life.
Angus, I need to just say that to sit there and say that that is about breaking democracy. Breaking democracy is suggesting that we get to a general election next year on a single issue thing. Literally giving the people... So you're honestly going to go to the polls next year. You're honestly going to go to the polls next year if you have to, or whenever the next general election is, if you have to, only having independence on the ballot paper when people care about so much more than that, and you think it's everybody else that's got a problem with democracy.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
On one single issue, you don't have to vote for them. It's up to the people. If the people choose to vote, they vote.
What about all the other parties, like the Green Party, for example? What happens to them in Angus Robertson's opportunity? But that is surely damaging democracy. That is damaging democracy.
But the people have got their own choice. They can either go with this single option SNP or not.
All right, let's hear from the woman there. Straining to put your hand up in the purple top.
Thank you. And nice to see Angus again. I think the panel's great with all their answers. But let's get this straight. It's a matter of timing. And what we've heard, particularly from Pam, I believe it is, which you've done sterling work there. And we should be listening to you, because I'm certainly for less able and more vulnerable people in our society, no matter where they live, Scotland or the United Kingdom. And at the end of the day, we've got a lot to put right first. So I think it's timing, Angus. Scotland, I will vote against, but if they get independence, I will be one of the first to make sure that we make that successful. Good. And that's what democracy is all about.
Quite right.
The members of the panel and others sit and point their fingers at the SNP, accusing them of being a one-issue party, and you say they're never going to take no for an answer. But we keep electing them. You need to wake up and smell the coffee.
Okay. Let me take one more point from the man there in the black shirt. No, we've heard from the man in the black shirt.
think,
no, behind then.
Fraser mentioned in his first comments about the fact that nothing much has changed in the last 8 years.
Public opinion.
I think everybody in the audience can see from the comments I've made a huge amount has changed in the last 8 years. One of the biggest factors that's changed in the last year is the advent of Boris Johnson and this completely incompetent Westminster government.
Very briefly, so I want to move on, Pam.
So much has changed, and the notion that the Tories are the great defenders of the Union is laughable, I have to say, and the only way to get Boris Johnson out of Downing Street is to vote Labour at the next general election.
OK. What a surprise you came out of that, Pam. There we go. OK, look, I'm going to move on, but before I do,